Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. We're again using, just reminding you, we've been away for a couple of days, because you won't notice it because I recorded some of these advances. We took like a couple weeks off, hence you can see the beard change and things like this. We're using the landmark Thucydides, the Crawley translation, uh, this paperback edition if you're using it. Um, we're using, for the purposes of you guys, we're using the Google Google Books edition that's you can see there. We're in the summer of the summer of the 19th year of the war. The spring and summer of the 19th year of the war. We're in book 7, chapter 19. Um, let's continue from where we left off, which is this is basically the height of the beginning of the Sicilian campaign, and the fact that the Athenian leadership, with Nicias left in charge by himself, he's not well, um, and kind of in a situation where he's kind of surrounded now not only the Sicilians and the Syracusans and their allies on the island, but also the Spartans have arrived with significant allies from unifying everyone against Athens in the Athenian campaign. So um, the first days of the following spring, in the earlier period than usual, the Spartans and their allies invaded Attica under the command of Aegeus, son of Archidamus, king of Spartans. They began devastating part bordering on the plains and next proceeded to fortified Delesia, dividing the work among the different cities. Declia is about 13 or 14 miles from the city of Athens, the same distance, not so much further, from Botia, and the fort was intended to damage the plan and the plain and the richest part of the country, being in sight of Athens, while the Peloponnesians and their allies in Attica were engaged in the work of fortification. Their countrymen at home set off at the same time the hoplites in the merchant vessels of Sicily. The Spartans furnishing a hand-picked force of helots and the Neodamodeus, 600 hoplites in all, under the command of Echristus, Spartaite, and the Botians, 300 hoplites, commanded by two Thebians, Zeon and Nikon, and Heraganda, Thespian. Fourth section of 19. These were among the first to put out in the open sea, starting from Terrenium in Laconia. Not long after their departure, the Corinthians set off a force of 500 hoplites, consisting partly of men from Corinth itself and partly from the Arcadian mercenaries, placed under the command of Alexarchus, a Corinthian. The Scythianians set off sent off 200 hoplites at the same time as the Corinthians, under the command of Sargus, a Scythian. Meanwhile, the 5 and 20 vessels manned by the Corinth during the winter lay confronting 20 Athenian ships at Nicopatos, until the hoplites and merchant ships were fairly on their way from the Peloponnesus, thus fulfilling the object for which they had been manned originally, which was to divert the attentions of the Athenians from the merchant ships to the Trimenes. During this time, the Athenians were not idle. Simultaneous with the fortification of Adila and the very beginning of spring, they sent out 30 ships around the Peloponnesus under Carius, Charicles, son of Apollodorus, instruction to call at Argos and demand a force of their hoplites for the fleet in agreement with the alliance. At the same time, they dispatched Demosthenes to Sicily, as they intended, with 60 Athenians and 5 Chilean vessels. Chilean Chilean vessels. Chilean vessels. 1,200 hoplites from the enlistment rolls, and as many of the islanders as could be raised in the different quarters, drawing upon other subject allies for whatever they could supply that would be of use for the war. Demosthenes was instructed first to sail around with uh, Charicles, and operate with him upon the coast of Laconia, and accordingly sailed to Aegina, and there waited for the remainder of his force, and Charicles to fetch the Argive troops. In Sicily, about the same time in this spring, Gylippus came to Syracuse with as many troops as he could bring from the cities which he persuaded to join. Calling the Syracusans together, he told them that they must man as many ships as possible and try their hand at a sea fight, at which he hoped to achieve the advantage in the war not unworthy of the risk. With him, Hermocrates actively joined in trying to encourage his countrymen to attack the Athenians at sea, saying that the latter had not inherited their naval prowess, nor would they retain it forever. They had been landsmen even to a greater degree than the Syracusans, and had only become maritime power when obliged to by the Medes. Besides, to daring spirits like the Athenians, a daring adversary would seem the more formidable, and the Athenian plan of paralyzing by boldness of their attack a neighbor, often not their inferior in strength, could now be used against them with a good effect by the Syracusans. He was convinced also that their unlooked for spectacle of Syracusans daring to face the Athenian navy would cause a terror to the enemy, an advantage of which would far outweigh any loss the Athenians' science might inflict upon their inexperience. He accordingly urged them to throw aside their fears and to try their fortune at sea. And the Syracusans, under the influence of Gylippus and Hermocrates, and perhaps some others, made up their mind for the sea fight and began to man their vessels. The fleet was ready. Gylippus let out the whole army by night, this plan being assault in person the forts of Peligothum by land, and while 35 Syracusan triremes sailed according to an agreed plan against the enemy from the great harbors, and the 45 remaining came around from the lesser harbors, where they had their arsenal, in order to join up with those inside and simultaneously attack the Pelentherum, Pelentherum, and thus to detract the Athenians by assaulting them on two sides at once. The Athenians quickly manned the 60 ships, and with 25 of these engaged the 35 of the Syracusans in the great harbor, sending the rest to meet those sailing around from the arsenal. And an action now directly ensued in front of the mouth of the great harbor, maintained with equal tenacity on both sides, the one wishing to force the passage, the other preventing them. In the meanwhile, the Athenians in Plataeum were now down at the sea, tending to the engagement. Gylippus made a sudden attack on the fort in the early morning and took the largest first, and afterwards two smaller, whose garrison did not wait for him, seeing the largest taken so easily. At the fall of the first fort, the men from it who succeeded in taking refuge in their boats, and merchants, found great difficulty in reaching the camp, as the Syracusans were having the best of it in their engagement in the great harbor, and sent a fast sailing trimeme to pursue them. But when the two others fell, the Syracusans were now being defeated, and the fugitives from these sailed along the shore with more ease. The Syracusan ships, fighting off the mouth of the harbor, forced their way through the Athenian vessels, and sailing in without any order, fell foul of one another and transferred the victory to the Athenians. not only who routed the squadron in question, but also that by which they were also being defeated in the harbor, sinking 11 of the Syracusan vessels and killing most of their men, except the crews of the three ships who they made prisoners. Their own loss was confined to three vessels, and after hauling ashore the Syracusan wrecks and set up trophy upon the islet in front of the Perinthium, they retired to their own camp. Unsuccessful seas, the Syracusans had nevertheless the forts of Pilium, for which they set up three trophies. One of the two last taken they razed, but put in order the garrison of the other two. In the capture of the forts, a great many men were killed and made prisoner, and a great quantity of property was taken in all, as the Athenians had used them as warehouses. There was a large stock of goods and grains and merchants inside, and also a large stock of belonging to the captains, the masts and other equipment of 40 triremes being taken, besides three triremes which had been drawn up on the shore. Indeed, the first and foremost cause of the ruin of the Athenian army was the capture of the Pelinthium, even the entrance of the harbor now being no longer safe for carrying on provisions, and the Syracusan vessels were stationed there to prevent it. Nothing could be brought in without fighting. Besides the great impression of dismay and discouragement produced upon the army. After this, the Syracusans sent out 12 ships under the command of uh, Agatharchus, a Syracusan. One of these went to the Peloponnesian ambassadors to describe the hopeful state of their affairs and to incite the Peloponnesians to prosecute the war there even more actively as they were now doing. While the 11 others sailed to Italy, hearing that the vessels laden with stores were on their way to the Athenians. After falling and destroying most of the vessels in question and burning the Calawian territories, a quantity of timber for shipbuilding, which had been gathered for the Athenians, the Syracusan squadron went to Locri, and while they were at anchor there, one of the merchant ships from the Peloponnesians came in carrying Thespian hoplites. These took on board and sailed along the shore home. The Athenians were on the lookout for them with 20 ships and at Megra, but were only able to take one vessel with its crew, the rest getting clear off the Syracuse. There was also some skirmishing in the harbor about the piles which the Syracusans had driven into the sea in front of the old docks to allow their ships to lie at anchor inside without being hurt by the Athenians sailing up and running them down. The Athenians brought up to them a ship of 10,000 talents, burdened, furthered with wooden turrets and screens, and fastened ropes around the piles from their boat, and wrenched them up, and broke them, and and dived down, and sawed them in two. Meanwhile, the Syracusans piled with them with missiles from the dock, to which they replied from their large vessel, until at last most of the piles were removed by the Athenians. But the most difficult part of the stockade was the part out of sight. Some of the piles which had been driven in did not appear above water, so it was dangerous to sail up for fear of running the ship upon them, just as upon a reef, though not seeing them. However, divers went down and sawed off even these for rewards. And although the Syracusans drove in others, even though Syracusans drove in others, indeed, there were no end to the contrivances to which they resorted against each other, as might be expected between two hostile armies confronting each other at such short distances. Skirmishes of all kinds and other attempts were constant occurrences. Meanwhile, the Syracusans sent embassies composed of Corinthians and Brassots and Spartans to the other cities to tell them the capture of the Pelinthium, and that their defeat in the sea fight was due less to the strength of the enemy than their own disorder, and generally to let them know that they were full of hope, and to ask them to come to their help and with ships and troops, as the Athenians were expected with a fresh army, and if one already there could be destroyed before others arrived, the war would be at an end. Now we go to chapter 26. While the contending parties in Sicily were thus engaged, Demosthenes, now having now got together the armament which he was to go to the island, put out from Aegea, and the making for sail for Peloponnesus, joined Car- Charicles and 30 ships of the Athenians, taking on board hoplites from Argos. They sailed to Laconia. And after the first plundering of part of the Epirus Limera, land on the coast of Laconia opposite of Curthia, at which the temple of Apollo stands, and laying waste part of the country, fortified a sort of isthmus, through which the helots of the Spartans might desert, and from which plundering raids might be made as from Palos. Demosthenes helped to occupy this place, and then immediately sailed on to Corea to take up some allies from the of that island, so proceed without delay to Sicily. And while the Charicles waited until he had completed the fortification of the place, and arrived and leaving a garrison there, returned home subsequently with his 30 ships and the Argives also. The same summer, 1,300 Pelorists, Thracian swordmen in the tribe of Dii, okay, who were to have sailed to Sicily with Demosthenes, arrived at Athens. Since they had come too late, the Athenians determined to send them back to Thrace from where they had come, and to keep them for the Dacian war seemed too expensive, and pay them each man was a drachma a day. Indeed, since Decelea had been first fortified by the whole Peloponnesian army during the summer, and then occupied for the continuous harassment of the country, the garrisons from the city relieved each other at stated intervals. It had been causing great harm to the Athenians. In fact, this occupation, by the destruction of property and the loss of men, which resulted from it, was one of the principal causes of the Athenians' ruin. Okay, their ruin. Previously, the invasion was short and did not prevent them from making use of their land during the rest of the time. The enemy now permanently fixed in Attica. At one time, it was an attack in force, and the other time it was the regular garrison overrunning the country and making forays for its substance. And the Spartan king Aegeus was in the field and diligently prosecuting the war. Great damage was therefore done to the Athenians. They were deprived of their whole country. More than 20,000 slaves have deserted, a great part of them artisans, and all their sheep and beast of burdens were lost. And the cavalry rode out daily upon excursions to Dela and to guard the country. Their horses were either lamed or being constantly worked on by rocky ground or wounded by the enemy. Besides the transport of provisions from Euboea, which had before been carried on much more quickly over land by Delia from Oropus, Oreopus, and now effected a great cost by sea around Cape Sunium. Everything the city required had been imported from abroad, and instead of a city, it became a fortress. Summer and winter, the Athenians were worn out by having to keep guard on the fortifications during the days by turn and nights by all together. The cavalry accepted, and the different military posts upon the wall. But what was most oppressed them was that they had two wars at once, and they had reached a peak of frenzy which no one would have believed possible if they had heard of it before they had come to pass. For all, for could anyone have imagined that even when besieged by the Peloponnesians and entrenched in Attica, they would still, instead of withdrawing from Sicily, stay on there besieging in the like manner? Syracuse, a city taken as a city in no way inferior to Athens, or when so thoroughly upset an Hellenic estimate of their strength and audacity as to give the spectacle of a people which, at the beginning of the war, some thought might hold out for 1 year, some 2, none more than three if the Peloponnesians invaded the country. Now, 17 years after the first invasion, had already suffered from all the evils of war, now going to Sicily and undertaking a new war not inferior to that of what already been in the Peloponnesians. These causes, the great loss from Declesia, and others heavy changes that fell upon them, produced their financial distress. And it was at this time that they imposed upon their subjects, instead of tribute, a tax of 20th upon all imposts and exports by sea, which they thought would raise more money for them. Their expenditure now their expenditure being now not the same at first, but having grown with the war, while their revenues decayed. Accordingly, not wishing to incur expense for the present want of money, they sent back one of the Thracians, at once the Thracians who came too late for Demosthenes, under the conduct of Dilipitrius, Dilipitrius, Prius, who was instructed as they were to pass through the Euripus, to make use of them if possible of the voyage along the shore to injure their enemy. Diothipidus first landed them at Tanagra, and then snatched some booty, and then he sailed across the Epirus in the evening from Calclis and Eubea, and disembarking in Bodia, led them against Myclaeus. He passed the night unobserved near the temple of Hermes, not 2 miles from Menacleus, and at daybreak assaulted and took the city, which was not a large one, the inhabitants being off their guard and not expecting that anyone would come up so far from the sea to molest them. A wall being too weak, in some places having tumbled down, and while others it was not built to any height, and the gates also being left open through their feelings, open through their feeling of security. The Thracians burst into Mechalea, sacked the houses and temples, butchering the inhabitants, sparing neither youth of age, but killing all they had fell in with, and one after the other, women, children, and even beasts of burden, and whatever other living creature they saw. The Thracian people, like the bloodiest of the barbarians, being ever more murderous when it had nothing to fear. Everywhere confusion reigned and death in all its shapes, and particularly they attacked the boys' school, the largest that there was in the place, into which children had just gone, and massacred them all. In short, the disaster falling upon the whole city was unsurpassable in magnitude, and unapproachable by any suddenness and the horror. Meanwhile, the Thebans heard of it and marched to the rescue, overtaking the Thracians before they had gone far, recovering the plunder, and drove them into a panic into Epirus and to the sea, where their vessels which brought them were lying. The greatest slaughter took place while they were embarking, as they did not know how to swim, and those in the vessel, seeing what was going on shore, moved them out of bowshot with the rest of the threat of the Thracians, made a very respectable defense against the Theban host, by which they were the first attacked, dashing out and closing their ranks according to the tactics of their country, and lost only a few part of in the great affair. A good number who were who after the plunder were actually caught in the city and put to death. Although the Thracians had 250 killed out of 1,300, the Thebans and the rest who came to the rescue, about 20 troopers and hoplites, with Sarah Pondias, one of the Botox. The Messalians lost a large part of their population, while Methilius thus experienced the calamity, for its extent as lamentable as any that happened in the war. Demosthenes, who was at the same time sailing to Coraja, after building a fort in Lucretia, found a merchant ship lying at Pelia and Elis, in which the Corinthian hoplites were to cross to Sicily. The ship he destroyed, but the men escaped and subsequently got another in which they pursued their voyage. After this, arriving at Zacynthus and Kephaliana, um, Kepal, Kepalina. Okay, that's one of those horrible words. He took a body of hoplites on board and sending for some of the Macedonians from Nupactus, crossed over to the opposite coast of Arcania, Arcania to Alizé and to Anactinum, which was held by the Athenians. While he was in these parts, he was met by Euromenon, returning from Sicily, where he had been sent during the winter with money for the army, who told him the news, and also that he had heard while at sea that the Syracusans had taken Pelynthrium. Here also Cannon, the commander at Niponus, came to them with the news that 25 Corinthian ships stationed opposite him far from refraining from war, were mediating the engagement and therefore begging them to send him some ships, as his own 18 were not enough to finish, was not a match for the enemy's 25. Demosthenes and Armenia accordingly sent out 10 of the fastest triremes with Conatorian forces squadron Hippotas, and meanwhile prepared for the assembly of their forces. Eurymon, who now the colleague of Demosthenes, had turned back in consequence of his appointment, sailed to Corea to tell them to man 15 ships and to enlist hoplites, while Demosthenes raised slingers and darters from the parts of Arcania. Meanwhile, the envoys who had gone out from Syracuse to the cities after the capture of Pelynthrium had succeeded in their mission. They were about to bring in the army that had collected at Syracuse. When Nicias got wind of it, he sent to ask the Centopia and Achaia and other friendly Sicils who had held the passes not to let the enemy go through, but to combine to preventing their passing, where being no other way by which they could even attempt it, as the Arigentines could not give them a passage to their country. In response to this request, the Sicils laid a triple ambush for the Sicilians on the march, and attacking them suddenly while off their guard, killed about 800 of them, and all the envoys except the Corinthians, whom 1,500 had escaped, were conducted to Syracuse. About the same time, the Camaranians also came to the assistance of Syracuse with 500 hoplites, 300 darters, and as much archers, while the Gleones sent crews of 5 ships, 400 darters, and 200 horse. Indeed, almost the whole of Sicily, except the Agrigentians, who were neutral, now ceased merely to watch the event as it had previously been doing, and actively joined Syracuse against the Athenians. While the Syracusans, after the Cecil disaster, put off any immediate attack upon the Athenians, Demosthenes and Euron, whose forces from Corea and the mainland were now ready, crossed the Ionian Gulf with all their armaments to Lampania, Lampganian promontory, and starting from there, touched at the Corradian Isles lying off Epigria, where they took on board 150 Epicurian daughters of Messapian tribe, and renewing the old friendship with Artus, the chief, who had furnished them with darters, arrived at Metapolium in Italy. There they persuaded the allies, the Metapotinis, to send with them 300 darters and 200 trimedes. Two trimedes, not 200, two. And with this, a reinforcement coasted on to Thurii. They talk about a chief that had furnished them with darters, right? Here they persuaded their allies, the Methapon, to send with them 300. He did that. I read that again. And this reinforcement coasted to Thurii, where they found the party hostile to Athens, recently expelled by the revolution, and accordingly remained there to muster a review of the whole army, to see if any had been left behind, and to prepare on the Thurians resolutely to join them in the expedition. And in the circumstances, they found themselves to conclude a defensive and offensive alliance with the Athenians. About the same time, the Peloponnesians and 25 ships stationed opposite the squadron in Niponus, in order to protect the passage of this transport Sicily, had prepared for battle, manning some additional vessels, so to be numerically little inferior to the Athenians, anchored off Arentius and Archaea in the Rhypac country, a place off which they lay, being in the form of a crescent. The land forces furnished to them by the Corinthians, their allies on the spot, came up and arranged themselves upon a projecting headlands on either side, while the fleet, under the command of Polyanthes, the Corinthian, held the intervening space and blocked up the entrance. The Athenians on Dalpius now sailed out against them with 35 ships from Naupus, and the Corinthians, now at first not moving, at length thought they saw the opportunity, raised a signal in advance, engage the Athenians. After the obstinate struggle, the Corinthians lost 3 ships, and without sinking any altogether, disabled 7 of the enemy, which were struck prow to prow and had their outriggers smashed by Corinthian vessels, whose cat heads had been strengthened for the very purpose. After an action of this even character, in which party could claim victory, though the Athenians became masters of the wrecks through the winds driving them out to sea, the Corinthians not putting out against them to meet them. The two combatants parted. No pursuit took place, and no prisoners were made on either side, and the Corinthians and the Peloponnesians, who were fighting near the shore, escaping with ease, and none of the Athenian vessels having been sunk. The Athenians now sailed back to Nicopolis, and the Corinthians immediately set up trophy as victors, because they had disabled a great number of enemy ships. Moreover, they had held that they had not been defeated, for the very same reason that their opponents held that he had not been victorious. The Corinthians considered that they were the conquerors, if not decided conquered, and the Athenians thinking themselves vanquished, not because not decidedly victorious. However, when the Peloponnesians sailed off and their lands forced were dispersed, the Athenians also set up a trophy as victors again, about 2 miles and a quarter from Epirus in the Corinthian station. This was the termination of the action at Nipacatus. Returning to Demosthenes and Eurymond, the Thracians, having now got ready to join in the expedition with 700 hoplites and 300 daughters, and 2 generals ordered the ships to sail along the coast to the Croatian territory, and meanwhile held a review for all the land forces on the river Thebius, which then led them through the Thurian country. Arrived at the river Heracles, there they received the message from the Conatonians, saying that they would not allow the army to pass through their country. Upon which the Athenians descended towards the shore and bivouacked near the sea in the mouth of Hellas, where a fleet met them. And the next day embarked and sailed along the coast, touching all the cities except Locri. They came to Petra and the Rhegrian territory. Meanwhile, the Syracusans, hearing of their approach, resolved to make a second attempt with their fleet and their other forces on shore, which they had been collecting for this very purpose, in order to do something before their arrival. In addition to other improvements suggested by the recent sea fight, which they now adopted in the equipment of their navy, they cut down their prows to a smaller compass to make them more solid, and made their cat heads stronger, and from these that support beams into the vessel's side for the length of 6 cubits within and without, in the same way as the Corinthians had altered their prows before engaging the squadron at Naupactus. The Syracusans thought that they would thus have the advantage over the Athenian vessels, which were not constructed with equal strength, but were slight in their bow, from their being more used to sail around and charge at the enemy's side than to meet him prow to prow, and that the battle being in the great harbor with a great many ships is not much room, and was in fact in their favor. Charging prow to prow, they would starve the enemy's bows and by striking with solid and struck breaks against hollow and weak ones. And secondly, the Athenians, for want of room, would be unable to use their favorite maneuver, breaking the line or sailing around, as the Syracusans would do their best not to let them do the one, and want of room would prevent them doing the other. This charging prow to prow had up till then been thought of as the skill of a helmsman, which would be the Syracusans' chief maneuver, as being that which they should find more useful, since the Athenians have repulsed. Again, charging prow to prow had been the skill of helms, and we talked about this. Sorry, I got interrupted a couple times. Repeating this is at chapter 5, paragraph 5, number 5 over here. Would be a Syracusan's chief maneuver, as them being that which they should find most useful, since the Athenians, if repulsed, would not be able to back water in any direction except towards the shore, and that only for a little while and in a little space in front of their own camp. The rest of the harbor would be commanded by the Syracusans, and the Athenians, if hard pressed and the crowd together in a small space, would run foul of one another and fall into disorder, which was in fact what did the Athenians most harm in all the sea fights, since they had not, like the Syracusans, the whole harbor for retreat. As to their sailing around into the open sea, this would be impossible with the Syracusans in possession of the way in and out, especially at Belinthium, which would be hostile to them in the mouth of the harbor, which was not large. With these contravenients to suit their skill and ability, now more confident after the previous fight, the Sicilians attacked on land and sea once again. Gylippus let out the city force a little before and brought it up to the walls of the Athenians, where it looked towards the city, while the force from the Olympium, that is to say, the hoplites that were there with the horse and the light troops of the Syracusans, advanced against the wall from the opposite side, and the ships of the Syracusans and allies sailed out immediately afterwards. The Athenians at first supposed that this was that they were to be attacked by land only, and it was not without alarm that they had and it was not without alarm that they saw the fleet suddenly approaching them as well. And while some were forming against the walls in front against them, against the advancing enemy, some marching out haste against a number of horse and darters coming from the Olympium and from outside, while others manned the ships and rushed down to the beach to the opposite enemy. When the ships were manned, put out with 75 sail against 80 of the Syracusans. After spending a great part of the day advancing or retreating and skirmishing with each other, without either being able to gain advantage of speaking of, except that the Syracusans sank one or two of the Athenian vessels. They parted land forces at the same time, retiring from the lines. The next day, the Syracusans remained quiet and gave no sign of what they were going to do. But Nicias, seeing that the battle had been drawn one, had expecting that they would attack again, compelled the captains to refit as many ships that had suffered, and moored merchant vessels before the stockade, which they had driven into the sea in front of the ships, to serve instead as an enclosed harbor at about 200 feet from each other, in order that any ship that was hard pressed might be able to retreat in safety and sail out again at leisure. These preparations occupied the Athenians all day until nightfall. The next day, the Syracusans began operations at early hours, but with the same plan of attack by sea and land. A great part of the day the rivals spent as before, confronting and skirmishing each other, until at last Areton's son Perinthias, a Corinthian, the ablest helmsman of the Syracusan service, persuaded their naval commander to send to the officials in the city and tell them to move the market as quickly as they could down to the sea and oblige everyone to bring what edibles he had and sell them there, thus enabling the commanders to land their crews and dine at once close to the ships, and shortly afterwards, the same day, to attack the Athenians again when they were not expecting it. In a compliance with this advice, a messenger sent, and the market got ready, upon which the Syracusans suddenly backed water and retreated to the city, and immediately landed and took their dinner upon the spot. While the Athenians, supposing that they had returned to the city because they were beating, and disembarked their vessels at their leisure, and set about getting their dinners and about their other occupations upon the impression they had done with fighting for that day. Suddenly the Syracusans manned their ship and sailed against them, the Athenians in great confusion. And most of them, hungry, got on board and with great difficulty put out to meet them. At the same time, both parties remained on the defense without engaging, until the Athenians at last resolved not to let themselves be worn out by waiting where they were, but to attack without delay, and giving a cheer, went into action. The Syracusans received them, charging prow to prow as they intended, stove in a great part of the Athenian outriggers at the strengths of their brake, and darters on decks also did damage to Athenians. But still greater damage was done by the Syracusans, who went about in small boats, ran upon their oars on the Athenian triremes, and sailed against their sides. From there threw javelins at the sailors. At last, fighting hard in this fashion, the Syracusans gained a victory, and the Athenians turned and fled between the merchant ships and their own station. The Syracusan ships pursued them as far as the merchant ships, and where they were stopped by the beams armed with dolphins suspended from these vessels and over their passage. Two of the Syracusans went too far in the excitement of victory and destroyed, one of them being taken with its crew. After sinking 7 of the Athenian vessels and disabling many, most of the men prisoners and killing others, the Syracusans retired and set up trophies for both engagements. Now, being confident, have decided superiority at sea, at no means despairing of the equal success by land. In the meantime, the Syracusans were preparing for a second attack by both land and sea. Demosthenes and Aristophanes riding reinforcements from Athens, consisting of 75 ships, including the foreigners, 25,000 hoplites. Nearly 5,000 hoplites, 5,000 hoplites, Athenians and allies, and a number of darters, Hellenistic and barbarian, and slingers and archers, and everything else upon the corresponding scale. The Syracusans, their allies, were, for the moment, not a little dismayed at the idea that they were to there was to be no term or end of the danger seeing, in spite of the fortification of Delia. A new army arrived, nearly equal to the former, and the power of the Athenians proving so great in every quarter. On the other hand, the first Athenian engagement regained a certain confidence in the midst of the misfortunes. Demosthenes, seeing how matters stood, felt that he could not drag on and fare as Nicias had done, who was wintering at Cantina instead of at once attacking Syracuse, had allowed the terror of his first arrival to evaporate in contempt, and had given time to Gylippus to arrive with force from the Peloponnesians. With the Syracusans would never have had set for if he had attacked immediately. For they thought that they were a match for him by themselves, and would not have discovered their inferiority until they were already under siege. Even if they had sent for help, they could no longer have been equally able to profit by its arrival. Recollecting this, and very aware of how of that it was now the first duty after his arrival that he, like Nicias, was most formidable. Was most formidable to the enemy. Demosthenes determined not to lose time in drawing the utmost profit from the consternation of the moment, inspired by his army, and seeing that the counter wall of the Syracuse, which hindered the Athenians from investing them, was a single one, and that he who should become master of the way up to Epipolae had afterwards of the camp there, would find no difficulty of taking it, as no one could even wait for his attack, made all haste to attempt the enterprise. This he took to be the shortest way of entering the war, as he would either succeed and take Syracuse, or would lead back the armaments against instead of fretting away the lives of the Athenians engaged in the expedition and resources of the country at large. The first before the Athenian first, therefore, the Athenians went out and laid waste to the lands of the Syracusans about the Anapus, and carried all before them as at first by land and sea. The Syracusans not offering to oppose them upon either element, unless it was with their cavalry and darters from the Olympia. Next, Demosthenes resolved to take and make an attempt on the counterwall, first by means of siege engines, as however the engines that he brought up were burnt by the enemy fighting from the wall, and the rest of the forces repulsed after their attacking many different points. He determined to delay no longer, and having obtained the consent of Nicias and his fellow commanders, proceeded to put into execution his plan of attacking Epipolae. As by day it seemed impossible to approach and get up without being observed, he ordered provisions for 5 days, took all the masons and carpenters and other things, such as arrows and everything else that they could want from for the work of their fortifications successful. And after the first watch had set with Eurymondon and Meander, and the whole army for Epipolae, Nicias being left behind in the lines, having come up by the hill of Eurychius, where the former army had descended at first, unobserved by the enemy guard, they went up to the fort which the Syracusans had there, and took it, and put to the sword part of the garrison. The greater number, however, escaped at once, gave up the alarm to the camps, which there were 3 upon Epipolae, defended by outworks, one of the Syracusans, one of the other Sicilians, and the other of the allies, and also to the 600 Syracusans forming the original garrison for the part of the Epipolae. These at once advanced against the assailants, and encountering Demosthenes on the Athenians were routed by them after a sharp resistance, and the victors immediately pushed on, eager to achieve the object of the attack without giving time for their ardor to cool. Meanwhile, others from the very beginning were taking the counterwalls of the Syracusans, which were abandoned by this garrison, pulling down their battlements. The Syracusans and their allies, the Glymph, with the troops under his command, advanced to the rescue from the outworks, but engaged with some consternation, a night attack being a piece of audacity which they had never expected, and were at first compelled to retreat. But while the Athenians, flushed with their victory, now advanced with less order, wishing to make their way as quick as possible through their whole force of the enemy, yet not engaged, without relaxing their attack or giving them time to rally, the Boeotians made their first stand against them and attacked them, routed them, and put them to flight. The Athenians now fell into disorder and perplexity, so that it was not easy to get one side or the other to any detailed account of the affair. By day, certainly, the combatants had a clearer notion, though even them by no means at all take place no one knowing much of anything that does not go on his own immediate neighborhood, but in a night engagement, and this was the only one that occurred between the great armies during the war. How could anyone know anything for certain? Although there was a bright moon, they saw each other only as men as do by moonlight. That is to say, they could distinguish the form of the body, but could not tell certain whether it was a friend or an enemy. Both had a number of hoplites moving about in a small space. Some of the Athenians were already defeated, while others were coming up unconquered for their first attack. The large part also of the rest of their force either had only just got up and were still standing, so that they did not know which way to march, owing to the rout that had taken place, and all in front of them now confusion, and the noise made it difficult to distinguish anything. The victorious Syracusans and allies were cheering each other on with great cries. By night, the only possible means of communication, were receiving all who came against them, while the Athenians were seeking one another, taking all in front of them for enemies, even though they might have been now fleeing France, and constantly asking for the watchword, which was the only means of recognition. Not only caused great confusion among themselves, but by asking one, but also made it known to the enemy, whose own they did not so readily discover. So the Syracusans were victorious and not scattered, and thus easily mistaken. And the result was that the Athenians fell in with a party of the enemy that was weaker than they. It escaped them through knowing their watchword, while if they themselves failed to answer, they were put to the sword. But what hurt them as much, if indeed more than anything else, was the singing of the Praeon, from the perplexity of it caused by being nearly the same on either side. The Aegeans and the Koreans, as any other Dorian people, and in the Athenian army, stuck a terror in the Athenians whenever they raised their Praeon, no less than did the enemy. Thus, after being once thrown into disorder, they ended by coming into collusion with each other in many parts of the field, friend with friend and citizen with citizen, and not only terrified one another, but even came to blows and could be parted with difficulty. In the pursuit, which many perished by throwing themselves down the cliffs, the way down from Ypres became narrow, and part of those who got into safety into the plain, although many, especially those who belonged to the first armament, escaped through their better acquaintance with locality. Some of the newcomers lost their way and wandered over the country, and were cut off by the morning by the Syracusan cavalry and killed. So let's start. Okay. The next day, the Syracusans set up two trophies, one upon Epulae, where this ascent had been made, and the other on the spot where the first check given by the Boeotians, and the Athenians took back their dead on the truce. As a great many of the Athenians and the allies were killed, although still more arms were taken than could be accounted for by the number of dead, and some of those who were obliged to leap down from the cliff without their shields escaped with their lives and did not perish like the rest. After this, the Syracusans, recovering their own confidence, as such as an unexpected stroke of good fortune, dispatched Sycius with 15 ships to Antigram, where there was a revolution, to induce a possible city to join them, while Gypius again went by land into the rest of Sicily to bring up reinforcements, being now in hope of taking the Athenian lines by storm after the result of the affair at Epoli. Okay, so let's stop here. The Epoli, now this is Demosthenes came in there, he rushed, attacked, and then what happened was that they went too far, and then they get routed. Okay, this is still this of the event. Okay, so therefore we're at chapter 46. So we'll stop here, and we'll continue the rest from 46 to 87 our next session. If you have any comments, please put them below. If you like what we've done, like, share with this. If you have any comments or criticisms or suggestions, again, put them below. If you want to subscribe, you can subscribe and recommend to a friend. Then you can follow me on social media. The information below. And if you wish to help contribute something, you can do that through the two means of Patreon and Subscribe Star. This this is not that. We'll see what happens. Okay, dokie. This will be the first part of the summer of the 19th year. We'll continue again tomorrow. Take care. Bye bye.